Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Sports Philanthropy webinar series. We're excited to have you with us here today as we're going to have a great presentation from Lisa Anne Thompson-Taylor and from Board Veritas. So before we get started with that presentation, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to remind people, if we can, it's always great for Lisa to have the videos on so she can see and engage with people as we're going through the presentations. The other thing that we recommend to people is, if you haven't had a chance, to make sure that you can take a look at our Sports Philanthropy social media accounts. We're pretty easy to find on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. All of this information is contained on our site, and all of our upcoming webinars are included as well. This one, whether you're watching live or on recording, we'll make sure that the slides from the presentation are connected and included as well. If we could just have people mute out your microphones just as a start while Lisa's presenting, and then obviously we'll open those up to anybody who has questions as we go along the way. If you don't want to talk, feel free to type the messages into the chat, and we will find a good stopping point and get Lisa's attention and have her answer those questions for you. Want to remind you that our upcoming webinars next week, we've got Good Sports, who's going to be here to talk about providing new sports equipment for different organizations. I know on this call we have Tina Serrett from the Sports Shed, who does a great job with her organization collecting donations of sports equipment and other things for facilities as well. So we've got some great resources to help organizations get what they need. And then on July 1st, we're hosting our town hall on racism and reform. We've got some fantastic speakers lined up. You can find all the information right on our website or sportsphilanthropy.org/fight-racism. So without further ado, I want to introduce Lisa Anne Thompson-Taylor from Board Veritas. Lisa is going to walk us through some of the best ways to put together boards of directors, and she's got fantastic experience in that space. It's an issue that many organizations struggle with. Typically the starting point, and I know Lisa will go through a lot of this, but the starting point for most organizations is, I'm gonna get my arms around who's close enough that I can pull them into the mix here and get them involved and part of the board, and then that causes other problems. So Lisa will talk about some of the typical challenges that she sees out there, and I encourage people to drop questions into the chat or unmute yourself when we have a chance for questions. So Lisa, thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. I'm going log cabin rustic chic like Aaron Paul, only without the chandeliers and the fabulous shindigs behind. So this is my version of log cabin rustic chic. But I'm up in Maine and I still have signal, so that's awesome. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and to talk about board governance. So everyone here is really committed to it because it can be a snoozer. So thank you for tuning in to talk about this subject. I don't think it's a snoozer. I find talking about boards fascinating because the volunteers and the people who serve on boards are fascinating, and the causes that they represent are fascinating. So it ends up being a reflection of a very interesting part of society. And right now there's so much going on. There's a lot of action on boards. So we are experiencing very interesting times. And I think that since I'm sharing, what I'll do is to bring up my PowerPoint. Can you all see this? Roy, is this reflected on everyone's screen? So that
Not yet.
Okay.
You have to just click on the window, the active window.
Okay. Screen share, that's it, got it. Okay, so I'll do that in a second, but I guess we usually do introductions, right? So we know who's on the call.
Well, we'll get started now. So since we're a
Okay.
little behind, we'll get going on that, and then we'll have people introduce themselves as they
All right.
ask questions.
Very good. Well, at any rate, so my background briefly is I was 15 years as a fundraiser in the nonprofit sector, and that's what I did right out of college. And a lot of major gifts fundraising, a lot of events, golf tournaments, galas, fundraisers for, any which way. So I come from the staff perspective in working in NGOs, and evolved 10 years ago. We're in our 11th year with a company that was designed to improve the nonprofit sector at a board level, because as a staff person, one of the greatest frustrations was dealing with boards where you saw a lot of talent sitting at your board table and it wasn't very active, or it was overactive. Or there weren't the right people on the board, or you couldn't attract the right people, and any number of things. But not having the right board with your organization really hampers your efforts as a nonprofit, or a for-profit for that matter, to get ahead. So boards are partners, and it's important that we find a good, that care and feeding is done well, and also accountability. So there's this sort of nexus of issues that make for a really productive board relationship. And so those are some of the things we're talking about. And as I'm looking around the room, I see folks who may be founders of organizations, and there's probably people with a lot of different perspectives. So I'm going to try and speak generally, not knowing who sits on a board and has questions about sitting on the board, and who is coming from a staff perspective, who's coming from a founder perspective. So I'll speak about some trends in the board writ large, hopefully without being pedantic, but knowing that there's ample times for questions. And there's a lot of resources I have about, our library is massive, our online library. So I have plenty of things to share, and would welcome anyone with particular issues or private matters, because a lot of things are confidential on boards and people don't wish to share. So there's always time for that. So without further ado, and hoping that my cat doesn't end up making an unscheduled appearance. And if she does, hopefully no one's allergic virtually to cats. Okay. Very good. I'll be looking all over the place, just on the screen and things, so I apologize if it doesn't look like I'm looking you in the face. But so Board Veritas is a company, again, I founded a little over 10 years ago, and it's grown from one that was focused on philanthropic counsel and board training to one that's looking much more on helping boards and organizations to flourish through ensuring accountability and rigor with board governance through audits. We do a lot of governance audits with organizations, and different assessments. So we look at alignment between what an organization is doing strategically, organizationally, administratively, and ensuring that there's a good level of connectivity and relationships between the work of the board and how that's reflected in the staff. So I have a pretty deep bench of talent from different sectors who collaborate with me. But that being said, let's proceed. And I'll get to the next page. So to talk about boards, it's important to know what the sector has evolved, and it's important to know why the sector has evolved and what things are impacting boards. What I'm probably not going to talk about right now is the 10 basic roles and responsibilities of boards, and what boards should be doing. That's sort of a separate conversation. And I'd like to speak more broadly, just with an understanding that boards are the captain of the ship. And so without going into too much detail, if we understand that in the US, nonprofit organizations are required to have a board. It varies state by state as to how many people should sit on the board, what those positions should be, and we don't need to go into that. But in the US, if you're starting a nonprofit, generally speaking, and it's a charitable entity, which is to say, but probably most of you are involved with that, and that's why you're on the call, or an association. So a charitable entity is a 501c3, an association is a 501c6, and those are the two where we see most. The C3, your deductions, by the way, are tax deductible, and of course an association, which is a C6, they are not. for the purposes of our conversation today, both have been affected by the nonprofit sector evolving. And I want to talk about why, because it impacts the board and your relationship with the board and how you recruit board members and what ails the board or what helps the board to excel. So when we say the sector has evolved, some things, and our world has evolved, some things are pretty darn obvious. Obviously, the slide was modified this spring because a lot has changed. But even before the chaos that occurred this spring and then this summer, there's a lot of things which have changed the nonprofit sector. And it started really at the turn of this most recent century. And the things that impacted governance were some of the catastrophic governance failures in the corporate sector, such as Enron and WorldCom, where there were huge failures of public trust when governors in these organizations failed to steer the company right. And it cost people millions and millions of dollars. It cost them their retirement. It cost people some of their lives. It ended with them in jail. And of course, there were plenty of charity scandals, and there continue to be. But it created a focus on governance, and it increased, it shone a lens on the people who are involved in that sort of black box of decision making in a company. Nonprofits are a company. It's just you have tax status that says you're a C3, but you're still a company. So what that means is that when the IRS 990 came out, of course, they decided to include nonprofit governors as part of this increased scrutiny. So the 990, the IRS Form 990, which all nonprofits fill out, has a section on governance, which you're probably aware of. But it asks a lot of questions about the board of directors, about conflicts of interest and all sorts of other things that nonprofit board members now have to be aware of. And this was never something that directors had to pay attention to in the past. So there is an increased, heightened rigor now to being a director. There are more expectations around being a fiduciary. 9/11 changed the way some of the priorities around giving for a period of time, and that was a bump, a blip, but it showed a lot of organizations that the public whim, if you will, and I use that term not to take away from the seriousness of 9/11, but simply to say that there is a whim to public giving. So something that's very popular right now, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's drugs and crime, whatever that is, it can change. The public's appetite can change when there is a huge event, and so your funding may dry up, and this impacts strategy and your future and all sorts of things. And all this stuff that I'm talking about now, this is the stuff of not only the executive director, the founder, but also this is the stuff that boards are thinking about and are need to deal with. The overhead myth was a very important document that came out. And if you're not aware of it, I'm happy to send anyone a copy of it. But it was produced about a decade or so ago between Board Source, the Wise Giving Alliance, Guy Star, and some others, thought leaders in the nonprofit sector. And it said that nonprofits should not be hamstrung by this false expectation that you spend no money on infrastructure and overhead, and everything has to go to programs. And I dare say that many organizations and boards of directors and even people who run organizations still feel very uncomfortable, almost phobic about spending money on things that aren't quote unquote programmatic and communicating that you are going to spend anything on things that aren't programmatic. But if you think about running a company, how could you possibly be a dentist's office if you're saying, well, we spend all our money on the dentist? The hygiene stuff isn't, it's not as important, and the receptionist not as important and stuff, but we pay our dentists well. And that's a flip example. But the idea is if you've undercapitalized your nonprofit, if you aren't investing in the technology and the other things to make it a proper running business, how can you possibly expect to achieve impact bootstrapping and staying in startup mode all the time? And so it's a document that's meant to speak to the public. It says, allow organizations to have enough money to invest in the things that they need to do to run a business properly. That has impacted the conversations in the boardroom, and what nonprofits are communicating to board members. Some of the other things, technology and big data, obviously I won't talk much about that. COVID-19, we're getting calls off the hook from directors saying, what do we do? We just had to throw our strategic plan out the window with COVID-19. Funding is dried up, strategic plans out the window. We're hemorrhaging donors, or we don't seem relevant anymore. We are relevant, but we don't seem relevant. What do we do about that? How do we fight for our market share? Very difficult conversations, but things that need to happen in the boardroom. And if these conversations aren't happening, if this isn't part of the agenda for a board meeting, or if a board meeting hasn't been called to deal with some of these things, then the board's asleep, because they should be. And political upheaval and polarization.
Lisa, let me jump in for a second. So
yeah.
When you bring up the, first of all, the overhead myth, I think that would be a great document to be able to share, and we can put it on the page with the PowerPoint and the video. If
Absolutely.
you hear that, that would be fantastic. Just send that over. In terms of COVID-19 and the political situations that are going on now, are you finding that a lot of organizations are coming to you for your advice and counsel on how they should approach that? I know at the outset, everybody was scared to sort of continue operations or ask for money, but now, 3 months into this, they certainly recognize that you can't just shut down your operations because you may have taken a back seat to COVID or the current political unrest. So how do you work with those organizations in that context?
Yes, a lot of people are coming with questions, and I've watched a lot of the videos as well, some of the webinars from the really excellent presenters who've come over the past month or two, and the fundraisers who've addressed that issue. And I agree with a lot of them that, no, you can't stop fundraising. What we tell the boards, because the boards oftentimes aren't solicitors by and large. Boards don't do a lot of soliciting. They're door openers and they're thinkers. It's great when they can solicit, but we don't ask them to go around oftentimes, unless it's a startup nonprofit, to do that. What we do talk to boards about is to evaluate your value proposition. And this is where there's a stumbling block. I can't tell you how many times in the past 4 weeks we get, we're working with current or past clients or new clients, and, the question is where, we're hemorrhaging cash, or, things have dried up, we don't have volunteers, we have these problems. Okay, well, what are you saying is your value to the public and to shareholders? And what we either find is that different board members are saying different things about the value, or they're using terms like, we support, or we enable, we enhance, or the terms that are soft and fuzzy. It doesn't stick. Funders don't want you to support or, necessarily to, provide guidance, or, soft terms are hard at this point when there's hard problems for funders and some of the public to get behind. So having the board think hard about what do you say that you're doing for people? Is it adequate? Is your value proposition adequate for the funding and the involvement? And if your board is unaware of that, because they are either disengaged or they haven't been sufficiently, informed, because they're new or for whatever reason, then this is a very good time to get everyone together and say, we need to tighten this up. Does our mission statement accurately reflect the work that we are doing in our space? And does it reflect the work we should be doing? Does it reflect the work we could be doing? And then more importantly, for some organizations, this has been a wake-up call. And quite frankly, some of the conversations we have with boards is around whether or not there's a better way of doing things that involves mergers, acquisitions, and efficiencies of scale through, and it's a difficult decision for sure. I'm truncating this down, but there's a lot of different ways that you can achieve impact that don't involve going it alone And so these are the times where we have those conversations, and it's all around a value proposition, feasibility, and the board's tolerance for difficult conversations.
What are some of the hard words that you would use as opposed to the soft words?
Things that, for organizations that aren't doing, so, I would say, people are connected, people are providing, people are assisting, to ensuring through it.
Sorry to catch you on.
It's a great question. And I think some of it's in the context of what the nature of the work is that you're doing. If it's one removed from being a direct provider, for example, if the nature of your organization is one that connects professionals so that they can facilitate, facilitating is a little bit harder. But if you're giving, providing, treating, administering, those things tend to be easier. Direct aid or direct service providers tend to be something that's easier for people to grasp. And if you're not a direct service provider, hands-on to children, feeding the hungry,
right?
Caring for.
We are, yeah. We're not that. We're the second, in the chain.
And I'm making no aspersions that that's not valuable. So we're working with an organization that's not doing that. But what they've been able to do is they went back, for example, and it's an international organization that prevents child abuse, Society for the Protection of Child Abuse and Neglect. And what they're looking at is saying, okay, we are not the ones, our mission says we're preventing child abuse and neglect. Well, we're not. You're not doing that because you're not out in the field as a barrier between an abuser and a child. What they're doing, though, is ensuring that they are helping the people who do that, the burnout folks who are the first responders and the social workers and the pediatricians. They're connecting, informing, educating, building awareness. And so they are doing those things because we know that first responders get burnt out. So what the board has to do is to reevaluate the mission statement and say, okay, if we say we're doing this and we're not, we're going to get called out on it because our metrics don't support that. And so how do we, but it's something, and the board has to get that. If the board doesn't get that, then the board is going to be asking for the wrong information perpetually to support a mission statement that it's not doing. And it's going to continue to talk about a mission that it's not doing. And then as soon as a funder or anyone else says, well, wait a minute, you say you're preventing, how are you preventing when you're having a conference where there's a paper? How is that preventing? Because over here, this is a shelter and they're taking the children and they're prosecuting the abuser. So that's preventing. What are you doing? I don't get that. So, it's, it requires some massaging, but if, and if your board isn't prepared to think that way, one of the things we have to talk about is, you got to get a board that can partner with you to think in a more dynamic way, to think as a funder would, or to at least be open to listening when you have a stakeholder come in, whether the stakeholder is a funder, another partner, a government agency, or bring in a consultant or someone else who can springboard a difficult conversation like what, we seem to be challenged through COVID-19 to retain funders, retain members, retain volunteers, whatever that is. We need to explore why that's the case, or we think we know why, but and similarly with the politicization, and I'm switching over to some of the internal factors. It's harder and harder for nonprofits to stay apolitical in some areas. Affordable housing, I dare say with athletic causes, and with education, with women's, there's a lot of issues that people are coming to us, and nonprofits traditionally have stayed apolitical, as is their, sort of they're not supposed to get political, but it's becoming so difficult. It's so difficult. And so then you look at your board. The board then wants to have political statements. They want to make political statements. What if they're making political statements on their Twitter? my goodness, I mean, what if they go out and say something and in whatever it is that they're saying, and it conflicts with what you as an organization are trying to espouse? So what do you do about that? And I'd be willing to bet there's people on this call who have had that issue where you follow your board member's Twitter feed and you're like, holy crap, did they just say that? Oh my goodness. Especially if it's the founder and they just, and whether it, and so this is a serious issue, and it's a short call to deal with all of those, but one of the things you can do is have a policy, and now's a great time to refresh your policy on how the organization is going to deal in an increasingly polarized society. And that is absolutely a board issue, and is something that you as a staff leader can tee up and say, look, clearly this is on the horizon and we better figure this out, because either we can see that it's going to be a problem because we're going to recruit new board members who are fabulous and opinionated. And so we want to have a method for dealing with this so we can say what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, or work with your legal counsel and philosophically figure out a way that we can be inclusive without, and there really isn't a right or wrong answer unless it's something outrageous. This is where it's not going to be in your bylaws. It shouldn't be. Bylaws should not be overly prescriptive, but it's the board's remit to come up with these policies and to refresh the policy so that it reflects the culture and philosophy of the organization in real time, knowing what that it's going to be very highly political and potentially polarized. So how do you navigate that?
Lisa, that brings up the question, as you look at the board, obviously many boards are contentious and don't have a unified philosophy in terms of what their vision is for an organization. And hopefully you're within some boundaries, even when there's individual disagreements on particular issues. But how do you handle it then for, you don't really have the authority to ban board members from tweeting or posting things on Facebook or Instagram. So again, how do you create that culture for the board where people are going to be respectful, at least on issues that relate directly to the organization's mission?
Well, that's a great question. And there are things that you can do. No, you cannot control their behavior, but you can control whether or not they are affiliated with the organization. And to do that, the board comes up with a policy. And you can call it a code of conduct. You can call it a social media policy. You can have a number of different things that it goes under. But, and this has come up a lot for us. Once that policy is created, and it needs to be created, and if you don't have it, do it now. Get it on the agenda. Traditionally, it's the governance committee that is responsible for holding the board accountable. So the governance chair, then let's assume you have this policy created, okay? It can be created by the governance committee. It can be created by the executive committee. It can be created by a task force. It doesn't matter, get it created. The executive director can create it. Get it done, but the board has to approve it. And basically what this says is that if you don't comply, that, the protocols would be you get a warning, and if the warning can be a conversation with the board chair or with the governance committee chair where you say, hey, look, this is just, we have a policy now which says as long as you're sitting in this board, we ask that you abstain from inflammatory rhetoric in this particular area because you're sitting on this board, thus you represent us in the public and you are legally a governor and bound by the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience as dictated in the state. So part of your agreement in serving on this board is to avoid that sort of rhetoric or that type of tweet or that type of, and ideally you have it done before you recruit people so they're aware of that before they sit on the board. And so you also have to give people, when you put a policy into effect, by the way, when people are already sitting on the board, you have to give them a chance to reflect on it so that they can politely, step down from the board if they feel it's something that they can't comply with. And that's fair enough. If they're an activist in a certain area and they can't comply, God bless and good luck. So you give people an out, that's perfectly fine. Get the policy in place. And then, it's really tough if it's someone like a founder or someone who has a big center of gravity and you have to, I'm not saying this is an easy conversation, but board accountability is huge, because if people are allowed to behave badly and it goes unnoted, then there obviously are no boundaries. And you think about that with your own relationships. You know, if a sibling or your partner or whomever continually presses boundaries and nothing happens, then, you know, your relationship's going to be fraught. One of the things that impacts the work of the board and the people that you recruit and what you're going to be asking them to do is where your organization falls in its life cycle. This is not a science, but it's similar to you know, for those of you in the for-profit world, you know, if we have any VC angel startup folks in the room, you know, who you have on your startup board as a company is probably not who you have when you get your VC funding or private equity, because all of a sudden you're going to have your VC on the board, right? Unless you're Uber or something else. But this, I want to really talk about this, because this causes a lot of challenges for people, because folks who serve on boards that are attracted to the bootstrapping startup, roll up your sleeves, I want to do the work, I want to do the fundraiser myself, I want to be very active, are not necessarily the same type of people who want to sit on a mature board, on an organization that is more mature, that has a board that's very much a governing board and a formal board that doesn't really, there's not a lot of active doing. There's a lot more thinking, a lot more deliberative work, strategy, planning, sitting on committees, because that's what's needed, because you have staff to do the work, and you don't want the staff, you don't want the board mirroring the work of staff. You absolutely don't. But, you know, in a small organization with no staff, that's what the board does, right? And so there's probably those of you on the call who are like, hey, we got no staff, the board's the doer. So we are doing the golf tournament and you know, and doing all of that. And so we don't have time for navel gazing. There's still, the board still has to exercise its thinking and planning capacity. But bear in mind, if you are growing and you're getting successful and you're sort of building and you're acquiring staff, you should have board terms and term limits in place, and you know, let people roll off. And if you want to bring them back on in a couple of years, bring them back on. That's cool. You know, you don't want to lose good people, but just give them a break, have them serve their terms, roll off. But understand that those people may not be a good fit when you have a governing board that has a different structures, because the meetings will be different. The meetings will feel less grassroots, and it will feel more like a think tank, as they should. And so that has to be communicated, though. It's communicated in their job description. It's communicated in reining folks in who want to be, you know, they always want to vote. They want to get to a meeting and they want to vote. And if we're not voting, then we're not doing anything as a board. And it's like, hang on, cowboy. We're not voting. We're talking today. We're talking about what to do in a poll. You know, the issue on the agenda today is what to do in a polarized, you know, in a polarized community, when we have to reflect on whether or not we want to participate in that, whether we don't. Do we want to be political? Do we not? We want to have a conversation, and it's not going to result in a vote. So you have to be comfortable with the fact that we're not voting, and yet it's very productive, or that we have to refresh our strategic plan. So what I find is it's helpful to put this slide up every so often and ask the board, you know, where do you think we are? And before anyone gets a little frustrated, where I have that dot where it says decline, it doesn't have to go there. That's just, you know, you don't have to go into stagnation and decline before you renew. That's just a spot. It happens, you know, often it happens that we're in decline before we realize we have to renew. But you can be, you know, if you have a good board, then the renew comes right at the apex of sustain. And so that's ideal, right? You want the board to be like, aha, we want to renew and sustain and create a virtuous cycle. We don't want to hit decline, and so something to consider. The other thing, is that sunsetting organizations is not a bad thing. Declaring victory and moving on is by no means defeat. Organizations have a lot of intellectual property. And so it's, you know, as an organization, not being afraid to have the conversation that says, well, I mean, our initial mission was X, Y, and Z. We've done X, Y, and Z. Do we really want to go back into startup mode to then build revenue another $5 million, $10 million, whatever that is, in order to achieve this kind of impact? Because right now, unless we have a huge influx, we're kind of wallowing around here for the foreseeable future. But what if we took our IP and sold it to another organization? What if, you know, I mean, there are so many different things you can do now, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. There are so many different options for achieving impact between the nonprofit sector and the for-profit sector and hybridizations thereof, that I think it's actually pretty exciting. It's frightening for staff because people think, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. You know, you're talking about, you know, the board's talking about things that are existential threats, and what is this sunset nonsense? I'm going to lose my job. It doesn't have to be a terrible thing if it's planned out. But if you wait until there's a disaster and you've lost your funding and you're operating in the red, no one's going to bail you out because you're not attractive to investors. And I'm using the term investor and funder. So for boards, you know, you want to ensure that your board is getting the best information, so they're making decisions ahead of a disaster, so that they don't have to try and appeal to bail out funders who aren't going to be there for them. Because bailing out a failing organization is too high of a risk. You know, it's not attractive. And for the philanthropists that I represent, you know, that we work with, it's just they don't want to do it for the most part, unless there's some really crazy good IP that they could monetize. Talking about the business model. This is sort of, so nonprofits, when you think traditional nonprofits, and it's like food pantry, you know, the church, the YMCA, you know, those sorts of things, they rely traditionally on donations from the public, right? That's pretty much it. Maybe some government grants, some foundation grants, but entirely philanthropic dollars. And then we started seeing different types of value propositions come up, and creating, like Habitat for Humanity, creating, you know, they are a mortgage lender. So they're a bank and a lender and a builder and a traditional nonprofit. I mean, there are a whole bunch of, it's like a smorgasbord of businesses wrapped up into one. Same thing, service source for people with varying degrees of abilities and disabilities. It is, they provide workforce to the federal government, workforce to private sectors. They have a benefit corporation that they run. And it's a whole bunch of business models wrapped up into one. Some for-profit, some nonprofit, but the idea is to create enough diversity of revenue that it's sustainable. And these were all, the board, in order to get there, in order to get the thinking from, oh, well, we rely on donations from the public, to what's in the toolbox now, requires a dynamic thinking ability and people who can kind of handle that. And also a level of fundraising fiduciary understanding that you may not necessarily have within your network of people or on your board. So what does that mean for your board? If you're not getting that, if you're getting pushback from your board and you're sort of frustrated, you can bring in outside experts to talk and to build that acumen, to build, to provide knowledge, training, bring in either, people who have done it themselves with other organizations, other board members, ideally. Peer learning is great. It's non-threatening. You can bring in consultants. You can bring in people from local communities and to come and talk to them, or you can find board members and add to your directors who do have familiarity with these different types of business structures. And they can help to demystify and take the fear out of what it would look like. And then have some ideation, have some brainstorming about what this might look like for your sector and for your particular community. And scope it out. Maybe not. Maybe it's now. Maybe it's not now. Maybe it's in 5 years. Maybe it's not feasible. I mean, what if even a nonprofit model, it's very attractive for the tax deductibility, but there may be such a potent value proposition that it ends up being a benefit corporation, which is to say a for-profit corporation that has a charitable purpose embedded in it. And there's a number of those out there. Rafa PC is a CPA, accounting firm out of DC. It's quite well known. That's a benefit corporation. The Big Bad Wolf is a pet store, it doesn't sell animals, of course, but it sells pet food and all sorts of things. The AARP and the NRA, National Rifle Association and Association of Retired People, they have so many different things going on that you don't, whether or not you carry guns, the benefits to that, the NRA were amazing. So it had, a huge, they were able to figure out a value proposition that just spread far and wide. And same thing with the AARP. Their benefits are wicked good. So again, those are associations, but just thinking about how they can create an appeal that just is, in some ways recession proof. Universities haven't done such a good job. I give them failing marks. In some ways, not all of them, a lot of them. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox with that. I need to leave some time for questions. Some of these slides you can actually just read, but one of the areas I just hear that we see a lot of problems, and these are technical problems. Again, not big issues, but technical problems. Where do board members kind of fall off the path and misbehave in board meetings? And there's about 1 million reasons why they're going to not behave well in board meetings. Either they're not going to show up, they're going to be checked out. But the most common things is that there's a whole bunch of reporting going out by the staff or the board. They're not, folks aren't using a consent agenda, which I'll describe in the next slide. So the dashboards aren't being used to represent where the company is, where the organization is in terms of meeting a strategic plan. Are we doing okay? Are we underachieving? Are we on target? Simple things in key areas, map to your strategic plan at a high level that the board can get. It keeps the board out of the weeds and out of your business, and it keeps them focused where they should. And you train your board that way. That's how you keep them from micromanaging. Keeping an environment of continual learning for your board keeps them engaged. And these sorts of things, again, as I've alluded to there, and I can come back to it if we don't have questions, but I want to pause a little bit. I articulate what a consent agenda is, and we'll talk about that and one other technical thing, but let me pause to ask for some questions, to ask for some questions, and then I can continue if we have time.
So I know one of the questions that comes up a lot when we talk to different organizations is, you've got it on the slide here, just in terms of how to best utilize the meeting time, because I know, as you touched on in these slides, one of the most boring things to do as a board member is to show up at a meeting and have the bulk of the time dedicated to rereading the minutes to you that were emailed to you a few days ahead of time, a week in advance, whatever the case was, and then to have to sit there for another 45 minutes while somebody's essentially reading line by line. I know you've got the concept here of a consent agenda, and the experts and guests and facilitators. I think those are things that would be interesting to hear about, because that's what adds value to the board meeting as a board member, because I do believe most board members want to get better and they want to help serve the organization. But when you are sitting there and you're served your food and somebody's rereading the agenda to you, that's not very engaging.
It's a snoozer. It's awful. I have a spray bottle. I'm not lying. I have a spray bottle. And you know how when the dog comes up and it's at the table and it's like begging and just a quick spray? I use one of those when I'm in a board meeting and someone starts reporting. I'm not going to lie. I use it. Folks, use the consent agenda. It's your friend. A consent agenda is where you gather all the items that are not controversial, that are report outs, And they go out, and if you're meeting quarterly, they go out, 2 to 3 weeks in advance. If you're meeting monthly, they go out, if you can get it, at 4 or 5 days in advance. For international organizations where English is not the first language, you want to make sure that they go out well in advance, because one of the problems for folks, or just for any group where English is not necessarily the first language of directors, they need a chance to process. And one of the problems with organizations that have a diverse board, where many languages are spoken, is that you'll find people who are either appear to be sort of bullies, or to be, air hogs, because they speak more. And it is those folks with who are strong communicators in English. So naturally, they communicate. And those who don't communicate well verbally in English are going to be more quiet, because they might use the wrong word. For example, in a board meeting, someone said to another member, they meant to say, I would like to get your input on something. And they said, I demand your input on something. And then someone else got very offended. For goodness sakes, but it happened. And so that's where the chair should have stepped in and said, I believe my esteemed colleague meant I would like. I don't, it's ridiculous. But these things happen. So this sort of cultural awareness is helpful. And it's something the executive director, founder, can help with. So in the consent agenda, you have meeting minutes, you have the president, CEO, executive director's report, you have the chair's report, you have, if it's a financials or just a report back, that's sort of an update, they can go in there. If there's notes, they don't have to. And other things. And you do not vote on a consent agenda, you accept a consent agenda. So someone would say a motion to accept the consent agenda, and where anyone opposed, and we consent agenda accepted. If you send it out in advance, people have the opportunity to ask for something to be pulled from it if they wish to have it discussed, or if there's disagreement, or someone can say in an email, that's not what I said, the meeting minutes are wrong, we need to fix that. Fine, you can fix those in advance, but you're not taking up people's valuable time. What people should be doing in a board meeting is talking about the most critical issues to the organization. Back to the second slide where we had internal and external factors. That's the type of thing where board members' talent is best used. Not helping you figure out, the best way around your golf tournament, or necessarily how to get people to attend. You've got committees that will do some of the partnering with staff. Use your board committees to do some of the more detailed work, but the actual board meetings, use that where the board members can think, can have productive time. The jargon for this is generative time. And one of my favorite resources for how boards think is called Governance as Leadership. And it's a methodology, it's a philosophy about trimodal governance that I'm just going to mention. And if you, I'm happy to, I have myriad articles on it, but it's been produced by Dick Chait, Bill Ryan, and Barbara Taylor out of the Hauser Center at Harvard. And it's what we base, Board Veritas bases a majority of its board coaching and training around, which is the board's use of trimodal thinking, acting as a fiduciary, acting as a strategist, and acting as a generative thinker. And so going between these modes of thinking stimulates the board to bring out the best, both in terms of, yes, it's doing its duty as a compliant board, but also it is harnessing everyone's talent around the table, irrespective of whether or not they have the same technical skills that the organization sort of is built around, but philosophically, intellectually, creatively, they can contribute to the conversation. And so when we talk about diversity in the boardroom, we're talking about diversity of thought as much as anything else. And associations suffer particularly from this, because they can have diversity in a number of different ways, but their diversity of thought is generally really lacking. It's all, we're working with a group of thoracic surgeons, the top renowned thoracic surgeons in the world right now. And the problem is their entire board are consisting of the top ranked thoracic surgeons in the world. They're rock stars in thoracic surgery. Can't navigate their way out of a box when it comes to capitalizing on continuing education. So, you know, or running a business. It's really a different thing. And that's true of every single industry. So the problem with one of the things, organizations that have suffered in COVID and are suffering when it comes to this issue of what to do in political polarization are often organizations where everyone around the board looks or thinks the same, because they keep dipping into the same well for answers that require a different solution. So if you keep not being able, if the organization continues to come up with non-answers or insufficient answers or nothing, then your brain trust isn't deep enough. And it's around the board meeting table that's oftentimes one of the only places that you'll be able to access this talent. So time has to be well spent. And that's ensuring that all the voices are heard, drawing on multiple information and perspectives through getting guest speakers, bringing in facilitators, holding focus groups when you need to drill down on an issue, having a task force to talk to the community or groups that you're trying to learn more about. Get a governance audit. If you're large, if you have enough resources, get a governance audit every 3 years or so to see how you're doing. And then if you're doing well, it's a great thing to show funders, because it's a commitment to accountability that goes well beyond even finance. It just goes to exceptional leadership. But there's, using executive sessions as well to be able to have conversations. The board needs to be able to have conversations without staff present. And if they're not using it, they should. It's somewhat contentious on how it's used, but if it's done well and it's structured, it's a very good thing to have. The board must have a constructive partnership with the executive director, CEO. And if this is another area where if there is a lack of trust, if we don't see communication, it's hugely problematic. If the board doesn't trust the CEO or vice versa, if they think there's like a gotcha kind of culture where there's surprises and the board doesn't know what's going on, or the CEO thinks that the board's up to some shenanigans behind their back, then that's certainly going to stymie the growth. And one of the other things are going to happen. The board's probably going to, let the CEO go, because ultimately that's untenable, or, you'll just be stagnating because the board isn't helping the organization. And then you have things where the staff makes an end run to the board, and that's unfortunate. So this is one of the areas where, working very hard through communication, through annual evaluation, the board, of the CEO, being done well and thoughtfully and professionally, not half done in a whimsical way, but really doing it well so that it's codified. Everyone knows what's expected, and it gives people a chance to plan for it and to continue nurturing that relationship through board retreats and other things where the CEO can participate.
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue when you see organizations that are splintering, when you get that faction between the executive director and then the leadership on the board. It's very hard to get work done when there's more time spent, covering your ass in terms of what needs to happen and getting everybody on the same page than there is in that collaborative fashion. And I've seen boards fall apart over that. I've seen entire organizations that end up going through your life cycle and going down that steep decline because there was such entrenched positions between the board and the executive director.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, so this, I could spend a lot of time on this. This was developed actually for one particular client that I can't name. We do a lot of confidential work because boards are confidential, and they don't want their funders to know, when they're going through a refresh period, and that's fair. But founder transition is a huge, huge focus for many organizations. Doing it well is really, really important, and for athletes especially, because there's a reputational risk and reputational opportunities, especially for folks in the athletic world transitioning into the corporate sector and in consulting and things. Who you want to maintain the welfare of your baby, of your nonprofit, and you want it done well, but you have to step away from some of the operations of it. But in any organization, there are so many dynamics that go into creating life beyond the founder, it's a thing. So what I will say is I'll leave you guys with this slide, which is a sort of our Venn way of representing things that an organization should consider on what to do with the founder. And founders are often the ones that also go rogue. You know, think about Steve Jobs. You know, think about some of the amazing people out there who have, you know, they're brilliant and troublesome. And we are all, I'm the founder of my company. And so I sometimes think about myself and if my team are having this conversation. I don't know. Not that brilliant, but
it's a challenging stage because you see that even with for-profit businesses in terms of the life cycle and the conversation about how most entrepreneurs are really not cut out to be ultimately to be the leaders or the CEOs of the organization, because their perspective is more in terms of the big picture and the vision of what's going on, and less innate for them is the execution elements. And when you had that other chart where you're building up in that stage 2, I think it was, where you're building up the infrastructure to support what the organization needs to do, you know, that's a challenging stage. And when you go through this transition process, ultimately, not that many organizations get here because they don't get enough critical mass, or the founder won't let go enough to involve some of the other key people that are needed to create that leadership.
Absolutely. Well put. Please and thank you. Questions or thoughts? I know it's 11:59, so I squeaked it in.
Well, you gave us a lot of great information there. If people have additional questions, you can feel free to email them to me, and then I'll coordinate with Lisa to get a response for you. Lisa, thank you very much for sharing your time and input with us today. I think it was very helpful, and I know that there was a lot of great information on here. So really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Everybody else that's watching this live and watching this on tape, we hope that you'll join us next week at the same time for the Sports Philanthropy webinar, and make sure in 2 weeks that you join us for the town hall meeting on racism and reform. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a great day.
Thanks, Roy.